Bryan Stevenson is a public interest lawyer who has dedicated his career to helping the poor, the incarcerated, and the condemned. He's a professor at New York University Law School and the founder and executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative, an Alabama-based group that has won major legal challenges eliminating excessive and unfair sentencing, exonerating innocent prisoners on death row, confronting abuse of the incarcerated and the mentally ill, and aiding children prosecuted as adults. EJI won a historic ruling in the U.S. Supreme Court holding that mandatory life without parole sentences for all children 17 or younger are unconstitutional. Professor Stevenson has won relief for dozens of condemned prisoners, argued 5 times before the United States Supreme Court, and won national acclaim for his work challenging bias against the poor and people of color. He has received numerous awards and honorary degrees, far too many for me to go through this morning without taking up all the time we have for the panel. But I do want to mention that one of his awards was the MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant. His recent New York Times bestseller, Just Mercy, A Story of Justice and Redemption, is a call for all of us to help fix our broken justice system. And interviewing him this morning will be Derek Taylor. Derek Taylor's career as a British TV news correspondent has taken him to Africa, here in the United States, and the Middle East, where he has covered 5 wars. During the Islamic Revolution in Iran, when U.S. passport holders were expelled, as some of you might have seen portrayed in the film Argo, his daily reports for ABC's Nightline were the only Tehran-based TV coverage of the hostage crisis to reach U.S. news. With his second book, Magna Carta in 20 Places, Derek returns to his first love, history, and brings a journalist's eye to the 800-year story of the Magna Carta and those who fought in its name. So I turn it over to Professor Stevenson and Derek.
Thank you very much indeed, Deborah. This is a quite remarkable book about an even more remarkable man. When I read it, I was left with 3 emotions, Bryan. The first was full of admiration that anyone would devote their life day after day in such incredibly challenging circumstances, facing man's inhumanity to man. The second was shock. I was left shocked by this book. And I don't consider myself to be having led a sheltered life or to be easily shocked. But the reason was that although I was aware in a general sense of the kind of injustices that you've portrayed in this book, Bryan, and that you devoted your life to challenging and to defeating, I knew about them in a generalized way, almost like statistics. But what Bryan does in this book is that he personalizes it. He brings to you those people, the victims of that injustice, whether it's on death row or women in prisons or wherever they are in the South. He brings them to us in a way which makes us feel that we know them. He reports conversations with them. It's a book, in fact, that reads almost like a terrifying novel. And as a result of that, in fact, the other emotion that I felt was that I was deeply touched by it. There were moments, particularly in the case of Walter McMillian, which we're going to talk about, where when he is taken off death row, I had to hold back the tears. So this is an incredible book. And Bryan, I want to start by asking you, how did you start your career? What was it that inspired you to devote your life in this way to this incredible cause?
Well, first, thank you for that wonderfully kind response to the book. I mean, as someone who's done the extraordinary work that you've done, it means a lot to me to get that kind of feedback. You know, I grew up in the rural South. I grew up in a community where I started my education in a colored school. It was 10 years after Brown versus Board of Education, and in my community, black children still were not permitted into the public schools. And lawyers came into our community and made them open up the public schools. It was the first time I'd ever heard of a lawyer. It's the first and really only notion I had of what lawyers do. But they opened up the public schools for me, and that meant that I could go to high school. There were no high schools for black children in my county when my dad was a teenager, but it opened up the world for me, and high school led to college. I was not really clear on what I wanted to do when I was about to graduate from college. In fact, I really enjoyed college. I was I was involved in music, I was involved in sports, I was studying philosophy. In fact, I didn't really ever want college to end, if the truth be told. I just was enjoying it too much. And I was a senior one day, and someone came up to me while I was sitting. I used to say to my friends, I'm going to go out on the hillside because I'm a philosophy major, and I'm going to think deep, big thoughts. And my friends, I now realize, thought I probably was saying I was going to do drugs or something illegal. But I was sitting out there, and somebody came up to me, and they said, well, what are you going to do after you graduate? And I heard it as a hostile question because I realized for the first time nobody was going to pay me to philosophize when I graduated from college. And honestly, I did not know, because I was the first in my family to get to college, I didn't know that in America, if you do graduate work in history or English or political science, you actually have to know something about history, English, or political science. And to be honest, that's how I found law school. It was very clear to me you didn't need to know anything to go to law school. And so I signed up for that and was pretty disillusioned I went to Harvard Law School. I was pretty disillusioned because it seemed so disconnected. I was interested in racial equality. I was interested in poverty. I was interested in doing something that advanced justice. And I didn't hear people talking about race or poverty or justice. And then I took an internship that got me proximate to people on death row. It was an organization providing legal services to people on death row. And going to Atlanta, Georgia, and meeting people on death row who were literally dying for legal assistance is what really changed things for me. It had such an impact on me to see people whose cases were clearly a function of poverty and racial bias. We had this saying, them without the capital get the punishment, and it was so dramatically clear to me that we had a criminal justice system in this country that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. And while that was intolerable in all circumstances, it became particularly intolerable in the context of cases where people were going to die as a consequence of that. And for me, the juxtaposition of seeing all of these condemned people with no access to lawyers, going back to Harvard Law School where everybody was debating which of the 20 offers they were getting from major law firms to take, that made this choice, this decision to go back south and provide legal services to the condemned a really compelling and a necessary one. It didn't seem like I was giving anything up. It seemed like I was going to gain so much more than I got. And 30 years later, I can say that's absolutely been true.
And you went to probably the toughest place in the US, in fact, to fight that battle, which was in Alabama at that time.
Yeah, I started in Atlanta for 4 years, and then we started a project in Alabama. In 1989, 25% of the people executed in the country were executed in the state of Alabama.
Yep.
There's no public defender system. There was none then, there is none now. We had no institutionalized services for people on death row. And so it was just too challenging to kind of make peace with all of these people moving toward execution without counsel. And so we decided to start this project, but it was hard. I remember I write about, we opened the project up, and within 2 weeks, I got a call from someone who was saying, I'm scheduled to be executed in 30 days. And I explained to him, I said, look, I'm sorry, we just opened, we don't have books yet, we don't have staff yet, we don't have lawyers yet. I can't represent you. And I never will forget him silently hanging up the phone and me going home that night not sleeping very well. And I came back the next day and he called me again. He said, Mr. Stevenson, I'm begging you to represent me. He said, I've got an execution in 29 days. He said, you don't have to tell me you can win. You don't have to tell me you can get a stay of execution. You don't have to tell me you can stop this thing. But he said, but please tell me you'll fight for me. He says, I don't think I can make it these next 29 days if there's no hope at all. And when he put it like that, it was impossible to say no. And so I said yes. And we tried really hard to get a stay of execution. But one of our challenges legally is that our courts, I believe, have made a priority out of finality over fairness. And they seem to be more concerned with getting to the end than getting it right. And so we started working on the case, and every court we went to said, too late, even though there were some very compelling issues. He'd been sentenced to death with a lawyer who did no investigation, put on no evidence. There were racist comments made by the prosecutor. He was actually from New York. He'd moved to Alabama. And during the closing argument, the prosecutor had referred to him at one point. He made the argument at one point that he should be executed in part because he was a, quote, black Muslim from New York. That was actually in the transcript. And no one objected. And so we went to all these courts, and every court said too late. And on the last day of the execution, the day of the execution, I got the motion from the court, the order from the court denying the stay. And I went down to be with him. It was actually the first case I'd worked on where we hadn't been able to get a stay. And it was really challenging to be with this condemned man. And we had a conversation right before the execution where he said to me, he said, "Bryan, it's been such a strange day." He said, "When I woke up this morning, the guards came to me and said, 'What do you want for breakfast?' At midday, they came to me and said, 'What do you want for lunch?' In the evening, they came to me and said, 'What do you want for dinner?' He said, 'Bryan, all day long, people have been saying, what can I do to help you? Do you need water? Do you need stamps? Do you need the phone? Can we get you coffee? Can we get you food?' And I never will forget talking to that man in those last few minutes. And he said, 'Bryan, it's been such a strange day.' He said, 'More people have asked me, what can I do to help you in the last 14 hours of my life than they ever did in the first 19 years of my life.'"
That's shocking. Yeah.
And standing there holding his hands, I couldn't help but think, yeah, where were they when you were 3 and your mom died? Where were they when you were 7 and you were being abused? Where were they when you were a teenager experimenting with drugs? Where were they when you came back from Vietnam traumatized and disabled? And with those questions resonating, he was pulled away. They shaved the hair off his body. They strapped him in the electric chair, and they executed him. And so it was difficult in those early days to make sense of fighting something that seems so extreme. But it would have been more difficult to not fight. And, Alabama was and continues to be a challenging place to have as a home base for this kind of work. But I've always been persuaded that if we can prevail in places where there's very little support, very little acknowledgement of the problems, then that means we can prevail anywhere. And that's been sort of our orientation over the last 3 decades.
Yeah, indeed. One of the things that struck me in reading your book is that there is, and I've never realized this before, that there is a distinction sometimes between fairness and justice. I've always thought of those two words as being synonymous, that they just meant the same. And it is quite clear that they do not. And it's particularly brought home in this book that there is an account that you give in this book, Bryan, of a man called Walter McMillian. And his case surfaces time and time again through the book. And Walter was convicted of a crime for which he should never even have been arrested, never mind convicted in the first place. The guy had scores, I think, of members of his community who could say that he was somewhere else when the crime was committed. He didn't know the woman who was the victim at all. There was nothing to pin it on him. But it seems that the justice system needed to find somebody to convict fast, and they simply picked on him and moved it through. And one of the things that hit me about this is that Walter became something special in your life, didn't he? He wasn't just a client.
No, I think whenever you're involved in this kind of intense struggle, you absolutely embrace the people you work with as they embrace you. To get someone to trust you enough to tell them things about their lives that are sometimes difficult and painful means you have to kind of open yourself to that kind of relationship. And yes, and absolutely, I think the thing that was challenging initially about Walter's case was, he was largely targeted by the police because he'd had an interracial affair. He was seeing a young white woman who was related to one of the police investigators, and that was the primary reason that they targeted him. But the evidence of his innocence was so compelling, it was so obvious. He was at his sister's house, 11 miles from the crime scene, at exactly the time the crime took place. There were dozens of people who could verify that he was there. The other thing that made the case particularly compelling for me was that it felt like everybody in the black community felt like they had been convicted too. People would come up to me and they'd say, "Mr. Stevenson, it would have been so much better if he'd been out in the woods hunting by himself when the crime took place, because at least then we could entertain the possibility that he might be guilty. But because we were there with him, we feel like we've been convicted too. We feel like we've been condemned too. We don't know how to tell our children how to survive and grow in a community where something like this could happen." And the other irony of the case, of course, was Monroeville, Alabama, where this crime took place, where Mr. McMillian lived and where he was arrested and convicted, is the home of Harper Lee, who wrote To Kill a Mockingbird, the beloved American novel that virtually everybody in this country reads. And the people in Monroeville love To Kill a Mockingbird. They market it, they romanticize it. The streets are named after characters in the book. When Gregory Peck came to South Alabama in 1963 to film one of the scenes for the movie, they immediately closed the courthouse and turned it into the To Kill a Mockingbird Museum. And there is this preoccupation with that narrative that existed at the very same time that this innocent black man was being wrongly convicted and pushed toward execution. And the disconnect, I just thought, was in many ways representative of the disconnect we have in this country generally, this country that affirms its commitments to equality and justice and fairness, that loves to sing these great songs, and yet has become the place that now has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. And so, yeah, it was a struggle to be in a world where there was so much pain created by the system of justice, while it was accompanied by all of this celebratory stuff.
Yeah.
You know, and they did some pretty extreme things. They put Mr. McMillan on death row pre-trial. It's the only case I've ever worked on where the client was actually on death row for 15 months awaiting trial. And the newspapers, of course, would refer to him as a death row defendant whenever they would talk about his case. We have a unique provision in Alabama where the jury doesn't actually make the final sentence. The judge can override a jury verdict. And in this particular case, I think the jury actually knew he was innocent, but they convicted him of capital murder anyway. There was tremendous pressure. It was a young white woman who'd been murdered downtown. The gun sales had tripled. There was a lot of community angst about this crime. And so I think everybody felt the need to convict someone. But they convicted him of capital murder, and they actually sentenced him to life without parole. And it was almost as if they were compromising. We don't think he's guilty, so we'll give him life without parole. But the elected judge, whose name was Robert E. Lee Key, people have asked me, did you make that up? I said, no, that's his name. Overrode the jury's verdict. We have about 23% of the people on our death row got life verdicts from juries that are overridden by these elected judges. And I think all of it just kind of conspired to create this burden for people of color in that community, for poor people in that community, that seemed really impossible to shake.
Yeah.
It's as if, we heard, all of us, that, 2 weeks from now, someone accused you of a crime in another city at precisely the time. None of us would be able to hear that news and not be disrupted by it, knowing what we know. And that's the way it was for that community. And so it was very difficult to engage in that case without feeling both the burden of that community, the need for relief for that entire community, and to get very personally pulled in, which is certainly something that happened.
And it strikes me as well that, and I think you obliquely allude to this towards the end, that the death penalty in these kind of cases is almost like legalized lynching. That when in history there was an attempt to stamp out lynching, what happened was that they substituted very easy death penalties. It was as though the state was carrying out lynching. Do you think that's right?
Oh, I do. I think that the death penalty in many parts of our country it's mostly a cultural emblem. It's about the politics and psychosocial attitudes that dominate and prevail in this country. It's certainly not about crime. It doesn't deter. There's no credible evidence of that. It represents something. And I think you cannot understand it without understanding the larger history. Part of the reason why I'm so committed to confronting capital punishment is because I think it is the most violent manifestation of the narrative of racial difference that we've all inherited. I don't think you can understand where we are in this country when it comes to things like the death penalty without understanding our history of slavery. Monroe County was a slave county. All of the black people there came there enslaved. And we created a narrative of racial difference during the time of slavery to make ourselves feel good about enslaving, holding other people. Slavery in America was not like slavery in other countries. In other countries, slavery was usually a transitional status that lots of people could fall into. They were societies with slaves. In America, we did something quite different, quite unique. We became a slave society. We made slavery a permanent, hereditary status centrally tied toward race. And for me, the great evil of American slavery was not involuntary servitude. It was not forced labor. It was the ideology of white supremacy we created to legitimate it. We wanted our slave owners to feel moral and Christian while they owned other human beings. And so we created this narrative of racial difference. We said that black people are different. They're not as smart as white people. They've got these deficits, and that narrative is something we never dealt with. our Constitution, the 13th Amendment, which prohibits slavery, doesn't deal with the ideology of white supremacy. The Emancipation Proclamation doesn't deal with the narrative of racial difference, and it's why I argue that slavery didn't end in 1865. I think it just evolved. It turned into decades where we used lynching and racial violence to dominate and to sustain that racial hierarchy. Without violence, without the threat of lynching, black people would not have been compliant with segregation. They would have drank out of the white fountain if that was more convenient. They would have used the bathroom that was most convenient, not the one that said color. But because of violence and lynching and threat, people had to comply with this ridiculous racial hierarchy. And when lynching became too intolerable for the South to sustain, there were talk of federal troops coming back to the South, lynching simply moved indoors. And between 1930 and 1972, we used the death penalty in the same way we used lynching to ratify this convention, this hierarchy, this narrative of racial difference. And you cannot understand current issues and current use. Death penalty in Alabama, 80% of the people on death row are there for crimes involving victims who are white, even though 65% of all murder victims are black. And you can't understand mass incarceration and these disparities in punishment that we're dealing with in this country without understanding this line that starts in slavery, that goes through lynching, that goes through the civil rights era, and that continues today, where we tolerate racial bias. The Bureau of Justice now reports that 1 in 3 black male babies in this country is expected to go to jail or prison. And in no civilized society should that fact exist and it not be a national crisis. And yet there's indifference, and we talk about it, and people really don't. And we've gotten used to this use of punishment that is racialized. And so, yes, Mr. McMillan's death sentence represented all of that. When people were making racist remarks to him, as they did, like the sheriff and these others, where he was being demonized in this way, this racialized way, you cannot disconnect that from this history. And so for me, fighting for him was like fighting against lynching. It was like fighting against slavery. It was like fighting against segregation. It's like fighting against this narrative of racial difference, fighting against this ideology of white supremacy, and fighting for something better, not just for people of color, but for all of us. I don't believe that we're trying to get on the other side of these things just because it's good for black people. It's good for every person, because we've all been infected by this narrative of racial difference. It has compromised all of us. We've created a presumption of guilt and dangerousness that gets assigned to people based on their color. And it's burdensome to have to live like that. It's burdensome for me, it's burdensome for all of us, and I want us to be free of this burden, but we can't get there when we hold on to these punishments that are just dripping with the blood and the history of lynching and the death penalty. For me, the death penalty is not about whether people deserve to die for the crimes they've committed. For me, the question of the death penalty is, do we deserve to kill?
Yes, what do you mean by that? Because when you wrote that in the book, it took me a lot to try and understand that. What did you mean by that we don't deserve to kill?
I was giving a lecture in Germany some years ago, and I was talking about the death penalty in the United States. And when I finished the lecture, I talked about racial disparities and problems with death. And when I finished the lecture, one of the German scholars stood up and said, well, of course, we don't have the death penalty in Germany. And of course, we could never again put human beings in gas chambers and execute them. And it wouldn't matter how guilty they are. It wouldn't matter what crime they had committed. We just cannot do that. And it was astonishing to me to see a room full of scholars and judges and lawyers all in absolute agreement with that sentiment. It was not a controversial thing for her to say. And I thought about that on my flight back to the US. I kept thinking, what would it feel like if today the German government still had gas chambers where people were executed? And I thought how horrifying it would be to live in a world where that was happening. And then I started thinking, well, what would it feel like if the people they were executing were disproportionately Jewish? And I realized I could not be at peace in that world. I could not make sense of that world. And then I got off the plane in Alabama, and I walked around, where buried in the ground are the bodies of thousands of people of color who've been the victims of racial violence. And so what I mean by the question is, do we deserve to kill, is that if we have a system of justice that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than poor and innocent, where wealth shapes outcome, not culpability, then you do not deserve to kill. If you have a system of justice where politics and the geography of the place and the politics of the particular prosecutor are going to shape outcomes, if you have a system that does not adequately represent people of color, that excludes people who are against the death penalty from even participating in the guilt phase determinations, that uses the death penalty towards some collateral end, some political goal, if you have a system like that, you don't deserve to kill. We've now exonerated 154 people sentenced to death. That is proved innocent, 154 people who've been previously sentenced to death. That means over the last 35 years, we've had about 1,400 executions. That means for every 9 people we have executed, we've now identified at least one innocent person. It's a shocking rate of error. I mean, if for every 9 subway cars that come by, one just explodes and everybody dies, nobody would ride the subway. And yet we tolerate this error in the death penalty context, and that's what I mean, that if we can't be more reliable than that, we don't deserve to kill. But I also mean that a nation that has enslaved millions of people and created an economic and political structure rooted in human bondage and slavery, a nation that has lynched thousands of people, a nation that has excluded people of color from voting and education, humiliated people of color for decades, burdened people of color with the badge and incidents of segregation and racial hierarchy, created a system where there are all these barriers. A nation like that does not deserve to kill if its killing manifests the kind of data and discrimination that the death penalty currently does. We ought not want to do it. And I actually think if we recognize that, there's something on the other side. I think if we are going to get to a better place, we need to publicly say we're going to reject some of these things because of our history. I've been, I have these weird dreams, I talk about them too much probably, but, sometimes I have these dreams, and one of my dreams is that I'd sit down with a Southern governor sometime soon and say to that governor, Mr. Governor, Ms. Governor, I want you to end the death penalty. I want you to declare you're going to end the death penalty, but don't say you're ending it because it's unreliable, because of innocent people, because it's biased, because of it's not poor people are getting bad, or because you're morally opposed to it, you don't think that's right. I'm going to say to that governor, I said, Governor, I want you to end it, and I want you to say you're ending it because we have a history in this country of slavery and lynching and racial violence and demonizing and presuming the dangerousness and guilt of black people, and a nation with that history cannot afford to engage in killing people, particularly where the evidence is allowing these people to be killed in ways that are racially disproportionate. It's a step toward reconciling ourselves with the history of lynching. And if we did it for that reason, that governor is somebody whose name we'd all learn. That governor would actually get the attention that acts of reconciliation deserve. That governor is somebody who'd become worldwide famous overnight. That promise isn't enough yet to persuade such a governor to do that thing. But I actually think there's something important in purposefully naming the end of the death penalty and some of these tactics because of our history. I think that there's a lot we can gain from that kind of exercise.
Yes, yes. It seems to me that one of the problems is that there is always a presumption that justice is fair, and that this acts as a screen for sometimes a brutal conspiracy that takes place behind. If I could give you an example that I came across once, many years ago, in 1974 in the UK. Bombs were placed in 2 bars in Birmingham, in the city of Birmingham, not Birmingham, Birmingham in the UK. And 24 people were killed. And it was a time of the Irish Troubles, and there were a lot of bombs, threats, shootings which were going on at that time. 6 Irish labourers were pulled off a train, and I covered the court case. And when these guys came up from the dock, they were covered in bruises. And the judge asked why this was, and the prosecutor said that it was because they had resisted arrest. And I, in my naivety, recorded this, and I reported it, and so did all my fellow journalists. Many, many, many years later, these guys who were subsequently convicted were found to be totally innocent. They were innocent laborers who'd just been picked up in the same way that Walter was made a scapegoat. We have to find somebody quickly, and they found them, they beat confessions out of them. Now, my point about this is that here was me as a white middle-class guy who made an assumption that justice was right, and that if a prosecutor said that they had suffered these injuries while resisting arrest, I believed them. Now, it seems to me that in the cases, many of the cases that you've talked about in this wonderful book, particularly, for instance, in the case of Walter, there's an incredible conspiracy which takes place. That the sheriff, first of all, I mean, this abominable sheriff who you came across there, who is manufacturing evidence. One of the things that most shocked me about it, in fact, is the judge. And there were things that judge clearly was not interested in justice, meaning fairness. He was not interested in that. He was simply interested in getting this conviction. And there are so many of these shocks there, and it seems to me that part of the problem that you face is an assumption that because people are wearing a judge's robe or a sheriff's badge, that they are somehow fair, and that they hide behind that. There's a dreadful conspiracy, which I found very shocking.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think, first of all, we're all complicit at a certain level, though, because, the politics of fear and anger are very effective. I mean, what gave rise to that wrongful conviction and prosecution of those 6 Irishmen was this atmosphere laced with fear about crime and anger. And when you're afraid and you're angry, you actually don't follow the rules. You look at any society that oppresses a group or exploits a group, demonizes a group, and they always have a narrative behind that oppression rooted in a tale that is designed to make people afraid or angry, and sometimes both. And when people are afraid and angry, they get comfortable with abuse that they would not otherwise be comfortable. This country suffered attacks on 9/11, and we got comfortable with things because our fear and our anger justified conduct that in retrospect I think we will one day recognize was not appropriate conduct, was unfair conduct, was excessive conduct. But that's what fear and anger does. And so these judges and the prosecutors are in many ways the profiles. They are the people designed, empowered to respond to our fear and anger. And sometimes it becomes more expedient, more convenient to get a conviction than to get the right person. It becomes more convenient to achieve an excessive punishment than a fair or just punishment. And our system, I think, has been absolutely contaminated by that. We're now putting people in jails and prisons for life in prison without parole for simple possession of marijuana, for writing a bad check of $100. You couldn't make sense of that in any other environment except the environment where politicians have been competing with each other over who can be the toughest on crime. And judges and prosecutors have involved themselves in that competition, and it does become a sort of conspiracy that corrupts, because no one is actually talking honestly about what justice requires, what fairness requires. They're talking more about what's going to satisfy this environment, which is why the rule of law is so important. If you don't commit to the rule of law, you don't need the rule of law in places where there's no fear, there's no anger, there's no bias, no discrimination. You'd probably be okay without laws in that society. You need the rule of law in places where there is fear, where there is anger, where there is the temptation to abuse the minority, to exploit the disfavored, to take advantage of those who are deemed different, religious minorities, ethnic minorities, foreign nationals, whatever. And I think the McMillan case was in many ways a kind of a profile in what happens when we allow our fear and anger and our indifference to fairness and justice to prevail, even in a system of justice that's designed to be a cure for that.
Yes. I said at the beginning that one of the emotions that was brought out for me by your book was one of great admiration. You're dealing day by day, you faced bomb threats, you faced threats to your life, you've worked for 18 hours a day, but not only all of those things, but you're having to deal with people who are on death row. The circumstances of being on death row are just truly, truly shocking. We hear those words, death row, and we visualize somebody imagining they're going to be executed the next day, but the circumstances, the physical circumstances are quite appalling. And you've had to watch your clients being executed as well. Terrible things. You reached a point in one case, and you describe this in your book, where you almost quit because it was too terrible. And I'm going to quote what you say in the book. You say, "I thought myself a fool for trying to fix something that was fatally broken." Tell us about that.
Yeah. Well, I do think that you can't be effective doing this work unless you're fully engaged. I mean, when I talk to people, I say, you have to get proximate, because it's only when you're proximate that you see the problems with the kind of clarity and detail that allow you to come up with effective solutions. And when you are proximate, that means things are going to happen to you. You can't be that close to a fire and not sometimes not only feel heat, but get a little burned. And I will admit to that. I mean, I've been doing this work now for 30 years. We've had a lot of success, and I feel at times misguided in complaining about the moments when things have gotten so grim. But it happens. It's part of the challenge. Every struggle, it seems to me, requires that you have the capacity to manage that. And I wrote about just a case that recently happened, actually, between 2009 and 2011, Alabama, 2009, 2011, Alabama had the highest rate of execution in the country. We had 17 executions in a 30-month time period. We have no public defender system, as I've said. There is no right to counsel for people on death row in this country. Once you complete your trial and appeal, the court does not provide a lawyer to you. So at any given moment, we have people literally dying for legal assistance. And so we committed to represent everybody facing an execution date about 7 years ago now, I guess. And it was wearing my staff out. I was watching my young lawyers just get beat down by these cases. And I said, well, I'll take the next one. And I got involved in this case. It was a man who was intellectually disabled. He had mental retardation. And our courts have banned the execution of people with intellectual disability. They've said you cannot execute someone with this condition. The problem is that the lawyers never raised the issue at trial. They didn't raise it on appeal. And again, our courts are very comfortable barring review of claims that have not been timely presented. And so I got involved. We had 30 days. I went to the state courts. They said too late. The appellate court said too late. The federal court said too late. And on the day this man was scheduled to be executed, the U.S. Supreme Court sent an order in about an hour before the execution also saying denied, too late. And I was talking to this man on the phone, and I gave him this terrible news. And in addition to having intellectual disability, he also had another challenge. When he would get really nervous or upset, he would begin to stutter. He would have a hard time getting his words out. And there was something about that experience that, I don't know, just really got to me. He was trying to get his words out. He had begged me not to hang up until he said what he had to say. But he couldn't get his words out. And the harder he tried to get the words out, the more it was just tearing my heart apart. I was holding the phone. Tears coming down my face. And I actually remembered something I'd forgotten. I remembered how when I was 9, my mother took me to church one Sunday, and I was there with my brother. And we were talking with our friends, and there was a little skinny kid standing next to one of my friends, and I asked this little boy a question. And when I asked the question, this little boy tried to answer the question, but he couldn't. He also had a very severe speech impediment, and he couldn't get his words out. And I, because I'd never met anybody with that particular challenge, did something really ignorant. I laughed. And my mother saw me laugh, and she came over and grabbed me by the hand, and she pulled me aside, and she said, Bryan, don't you ever laugh at somebody because they can't get their words out right. Don't you ever do that. And then she said to me, now you go back over there and you tell that little boy you're sorry. And I took a step, and my mother grabbed me by the arm. She said, wait. She said, after you tell that little boy you're sorry, I want you to hug that little boy. I kind of rolled my eyes. I said, okay, Mom. And I took a step, and she grabbed me by the arm. She said, wait. After you hug that little boy, I want you to tell that little boy you love him. I said, Mom, I can't go over there and tell that little boy. And she gave me that look again. So I said, okay. And I remembered going over to this little boy and walking up to him and saying, look, man, I'm sorry. And then I sort of lunged at him and gave him my little boy version of a man hug. And then what I remembered that night, the night of this execution, was I remembered saying to that little boy as insincerely as I possibly could, I said, I love you. And what I'd forgotten was how the little boy hugged me back and whispered flawlessly in my ear. He said, I love you too. And I was thinking about that while this man was trying to get his words out, and the tears were running down my face. And finally the man said, I want to thank you for representing me. I want to thank you for fighting for me. And then he said, I love you for trying to save my life. Hung up the phone walked away, put him on a gurney, they executed. And that was the moment when I thought, I can't do this anymore. It's too hard, too hard, too hard, too hard, too hard. The question I had in my head was, I kept thinking about how broken he was, and the question I had in my head is, why do we want to kill all the broken people in this country? What is it about us that when we see brokenness, we want to crush it, we want to step on it, we want to kill it, we want to hide it, we want to throw it away? And that's when I realized that all of my clients are broken people. They've been broken by disability, they've been broken by poverty, they've been broken by racism. I work in a broken system. Too many people too far away to see the real problems, to even do justice because of the distance they've created between them and those they judge. And I just said, I don't want to do this anymore. And when you have those kinds of moments, you have to ask yourself, well, why have you been doing what you're doing? You have to have that process before you make a big life change. And I realized something I'd never realized before. I realized that I don't do what I do because it's important. I don't do what I do because somebody has to do it. I don't do what I do because I've been trained to do it. I don't do what I do because it's about human rights. I don't do what I do because it's about social justice. I realized that night that I do what I do because I'm broken too. And the truth is, you cannot advance justice. You cannot do hard things. You can't get proximate without being broke a little bit. It will cut you. It will hurt you. You will feel pain. But I also learned that night that there's a power in brokenness. It's the broken who truly understand what it means to be compassionate, to be merciful. You learn something about mercy and compassion and justice when you've been broken a little. And that's why it became impossible to not keep working. I'm not trying to help broken people get justice. I'm trying to help myself. And if they don't get it, I don't get it. We are part of a broken community. You don't give mercy to the people who deserve it. You give mercy to the people who don't deserve it. That's why it's mercy. And if we want mercy, we have to give mercy. And I wanted some mercy that night, and I realized that I couldn't stop trying to facilitate that for other people. But I also realized that, my work is a continuation of a whole community of people's work. I sometimes look out the window in Montgomery, Alabama, and I reflect on the fact that 60 years ago, people trying to do what I'm trying to do had to sometimes say, my head is bloodied but not bowed. And yet they kept fighting. And so that gives me perspective that we can and should and must, keep fighting, keep doing the things that have to be done, even if it breaks us from time to time, even if it causes us those moments where we want to give up. That's the necessary component of justice. People say, well, what is justice anyway? You talk so much about it. For me, justice is a constant struggle. It's struggling even when it doesn't feel comfortable or easy or happy. It's doing those difficult things. It's standing when other people are saying, sit down. It's speaking when other people are saying, be quiet. And that tradition is what has produced wonderful moments. It's what gave me the opportunity to go to high school. And so I feel this, not obligation, but this privilege to keep fighting in the way that we're trying.
I wonder if you allow me to tell you one of the stories from the book, which
Sure.
I think is charming and very telling as well. Bryan tells the story of how he had a particularly all his cases are particularly difficult case with a young black guy, I think, who and you were trying to work out how you were going to present this case to the court, and he couldn't sleep. Bryan couldn't sleep. And so you know what it's like in the middle of the night when you can't sleep and you come up with all these, and Bryan said to himself, what we should do is that we shouldn't be trying him as a 16-year-old black kid from Alabama. We should be trying him as a 75-year-old white corporate executive. And so he thought, this is a brilliant idea, and he went to sleep. And when Bryan woke up the next morning, he thought, oh gosh, what was I thinking last night? But not only that, he had sent an email to the judge with that in it. And he found himself the next day having to defend this position. It's a perfectly reasonable position, but you had a lot of trouble, I think, actually trying to convince the judge. Tell me something else. You met Rosa Parks, and you know Rosa Parks, that great hero of the civil rights movement. Tell us about that.
Well, she was an amazing person. I mean, I think that's been the great privilege of practicing where I practice. I'm just surrounded by a community of extraordinary people who've done amazing things. Just in the last month, two of my really amazing mentors, Julian Bond and Amelia Boynton Robinson, passed on, and these are the kinds of people I would sometimes spend time with. But yeah, Ms. Parks was an amazing force. When I moved to Montgomery, Johnny Carr, her close friend, who was the organizer of the Montgomery bus boycott, she called me as soon as I got there, and she said, Bryan, I understand you're a young lawyer, and you just moved to Montgomery. I said, yes, I am. She says, well, my name is Johnny Carr. I'm the architect of the Montgomery bus boycott. And if you're a young lawyer, I'm going to call you up sometimes. I'm going to ask you to go someplace and speak. And then she said, sometimes I'm going to call you up and ask you to go someplace and listen. And she said, when I call you up and ask you to do something, you're going to say, yes, ma'am. So I said, yes, ma'am. And one day she called me up and she said, Bryan, Rosa Parks is coming to town. She's coming back from Detroit, and we're going to get together over at Virginia Durr's house and talk. Virginia Durr is a white woman whose husband, Clifford Durr, represented Dr. King. And she said, do you want to come over and listen? I said, oh, yes, ma'am, I do. And she said, Bryan, what does the word listen mean? She sometimes would ask me that. I said, it means I'm not going to say anything, Miss Carr. She said, okay, you can come. And the first time I met Ms. Parks, it was astonishing to me because these women were talking, but they weren't talking about what they had done. They were talking about what they were planning to do. And they were in their 80s, and they still had this hopefulness and this energy and this passion. And I listened to them talk, and after a couple of hours, Ms. Parks turned to me. She said, now, Bryan, tell me again, what's the Equal Justice Initiative? Tell me what you're trying to do. And I looked at Ms. Carr to see if I had permission to speak, and she nodded. And so I gave her my rap. I said, we're trying to do something to end the death penalty. We're trying to confront conditions of confinement. We want to do something about poverty. We want to do something about racial bias. We want to do something to help kids prosecuted as adults. We want to do something about the mentally ill. We're trying to do something about women being sent to jails and prisons. I gave her my whole rap, and when I finished, she looked at me. She said, She said, that's going to make you tired, tired, tired. And that's when Ms. Carr leaned forward and she put her finger in my face and she said, that's why you've got to be brave, brave, brave. And that's what I think about when I think about Ms. Parks. She was tireless in her efforts to keep fighting. I got to spend some more time with her later on, and she was always courageous, always. And, she and so many like her have taught me the importance of being courageous. You can't just do what's comfortable and convenient. Sometimes you have to do what's uncomfortable and inconvenient if you really want to achieve justice.
And it's not easy to do either, to be brave.
No, it's
not easy to do.
Not at all.
Okay, I think we've got a few minutes left, and I'm sure there are lots of questions that you'd like to ask Bryan. So would anyone like to? Yes, the gentleman at the back with the beard.
Yeah. So the question is,
So
the question is, what is the status of inadequate defense or indigent defense in this country at this time? I think we're in a really bad place. I mean, you first of all have to appreciate that we had a prison population in America of 300,000 in 1972. Today we have a prison population of 2.3 million. We've declared a misguided war on drugs. There are 6 million people on probation and parole. There are 70 million Americans with criminal arrests. And while we have gone from $6 billion on spending $6 billion a year on jails and prisons in 1980 to $80 billion today, and we've spent hundreds of millions more dollars on policing and prosecutors and judicial services and jails and prisons, we have not made a corresponding increase in indigent defense. And as a result, I don't think there's been a time in American history when the poor have been so poorly served by our system of providing lawyers. Public defender offices have dockets that are 5 times what they should be. The states that don't have public defender systems pay too little money to get effective work. And I think it's the reason why we're living at a time when I believe there are more innocent people in jails and prisons, more wrongly convicted people in jails and prisons than have ever existed in American history. And so I think we have a real crisis. If we're going to maintain and sustain this level of punishment, we'd have to spend billions on indigent defense to even get close to saying we're where we need to be. And we haven't spent those billions. Governments don't value those legal services to the poor. And so I think it's actually quite shameful where we are. Now, I'd like to see us cut the prison population by 50% in the next 8 years. And I think we could do that. If we declared an end to this misguided war on drugs, if we actually adopted policies that were about correction and rehabilitation, we could save $40 billion in the next 80 years. I'd like a portion of that money to then go into indigent defense so that the other people who are going to be sent to jail or prison can be sent with the confidence that they've been adequately defended. Right now, there are very few cases, including death penalty cases, where you can have confidence that the person has been adequately defended. That's the exception rather than the norm. And I think for a country like ours, that ought to be a crisis.
Yes, the lady there.
Yeah.
Bridge that gap, because the public defenders in states where they're available is really those people's lifelines.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really troubled me to see that the people who were supposed to be zealously advocating for these people really didn't understand the people who were serving.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I do think that a lot of what happens in offices is structural, right? So you're a committed person. You care deeply about the people you represent. You're a skilled an attorney. You've had good training. You've got all the dedication you want. If I give you 10 clients, you're going to be a brilliant lawyer for those 10 clients. They may not all get what you think they should get. They may not all get the outcome that you seek. But it will be a quality experience for you and for them, and they will be well represented. But if I give you 100 clients, you with your same dedication, passion, and commitment become less capable of doing the things that you believe should be done. And if I give you 500 clients, you then have a structural problem that will not be overcome by more trainings for the lawyers, more time with the lawyers, more anything, education for the lawyers. That's a structural problem that cannot be solved by doing something more with the people in those situations. We've got to change those structures. There are other places where the people coming into the system are accepting appointment in these cases and sometimes taking jobs when they don't have any sense of commitment or engagement to that client population. And it doesn't matter whether they have 10 clients or 10,000, they're not going to do the things that need to be done. So we have to have two lenses, in my view. We've got to deal with the structural problems that keep good people from doing good work on behalf of clients. And then we've got to make sure that once we've solved those structural problems, we get good people into these roles. I think we have a real problem in the justice system generally, not just in the defense role, where the people that are oftentimes being put in these roles are the people least prepared to do them effectively. I think that about police. I think, in a society like ours, the role of the police officer is actually a really critically important one. And the people we want in that role are people with high emotional IQ, the skills and the savvy and the insight of a social worker, the habits of a teacher, a counselor, a mentor. And the last thing we need is for people who are quick to pull their weapons and can shoot really well. That's the last characteristic that you want for a police officer. And the same is true for a defense attorney. You don't want somebody who is indifferent to that function, who doesn't understand that they are representing, that they are the lifeline between these communities that have been marginalized and demonized for decades. You become the face of perhaps the only hope they're going to encounter, and you have to accept that responsibility. So I do think that dealing with both the structural and the way we prepare people for these roles is a very, very high priority.
Good, thank you. Yes, the lady on the front row.
I'm a public defender here in New York. I do appeals, actually.
Yeah.
And I can't stop thinking about this case I had last week, 3 days ago, the guy that he's a homeless, mentally ill, first-time felony offender, and he got 12 years. And so it's interesting for me to think about, the world talks about, the innocent and all these, lost cases that are very fancy. And then we have my client homeless and mentally ill and is now upstate for 12 years.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, 1 in a million cases of mine. But, I don't know, I thought just to comment
Sure.
about there's the innocent, and then there's also people that just sit there forever.
Yeah.
Life without parole is not any better.
Yeah.
So I cannot stop thinking about this client. He's just in my heart.
Sure.
Always.
Yeah. Well, I think what you're expressing is really critical. You're absolutely right that I think in some ways the preoccupation with innocence has undermined our ability to make a better system. And because when we're talking about innocent, we're talking about the demonstrably innocent, right? Because there are lots of innocent people for whom there can never be any definitive proof, and for them, we don't even give them that thought. Our commitment is to have a fair and just system. And that's a system primarily designed for people who actually did something that they should not have done. And so I do agree. First of all, with the mentally ill, 50% of the people in jails and prisons suffer from mental illness. 20% are acutely mentally ill. And most of them are there because of that disability. Affluent people with mental illness actually get the care and resources that they need to keep them out of jails or prisons. We deinstitutionalized in the early part of the 20th century, and I get that. We had these horrible facilities that were warehouses for the mentally ill where they were being abused and mistreated. But we abandoned the concept of institutional care for the mentally ill, and that has created a crisis that jails and prisons and the criminal justice system has filled. And that means that most of the clients that a lot of defenders see are people suffering from mental illness, and the manifestations of that mental illness sometimes are illegal But the source of the problem is mental illness. And putting them in prison for 12 years doesn't do anything to solve the problem. In fact, it aggravates the problem. You put somebody with mental health disorders in a crowded, unsafe jail or prison, and it's cruel. And so I do think we have to engage more honestly with how we're going to deal with the challenges of mental illness in a country like ours. The other thing we have to do is to be more sensible in our sentencing. All of the sentences that I see are extreme. They're way too harsh. They're way too harsh. I mean, 12 years for what? For something that didn't even disrupt life in that community in the way that it's being projected. So we're going to have to get some rationality in sentencing, and to do that, we're going to have to elevate the needs of the mentally ill, the needs of children, the needs of the poor, the needs of people of color, the needs of the folks who've been marginalized for too long.
Thank you very much, Bryan. I think we're just running out of time. I'm terribly sorry. Can I just end by saying, whatever else you do today, you must buy this